So the Big 12 has announced that they are not going to add UConn, which is why was that ever even an option? And I think it's an insanely interesting conversation, but ultimately what the conversation boils down to is it's the quote for Brett Yormark, who I think it's pretty clear wanted UConn. It's pretty clear if you use the old Hamilton quote, "You don't have the votes. You don't have the votes." He doesn't have the votes. He can't get everybody in the Big 12 to say, "Yep, let's add UConn." And it sounded as if it's an insanely detailed and complicated situation where they would be added in all sports and then they'd get football into the conference by 2031. Like, we're going to do almost two more presidential, we're going to do nearly three more presidential elections before you get UConn in the conference. That feels insane. And yet, that was on the table. And I know, obviously, that it's a basketball-driven move, right? Like, it without a shadow of a doubt, because UConn's football program, outside of really one strong, good year, has not been the quality that you would expect for the Big 12 to consider an addition like that. So obviously it's a basketball-motivated move, but I find it really interesting, or I would find interesting, maybe who the yes votes and the no votes are. Because is UConn going to bring enough money? Essentially the question is UConn basketball going to bring enough money to make that move worthwhile? And I would say that the answer is no. Because if they did / were going to be worth that, they would have the votes. But they don't. I would imagine that the schools in Eastern Time Zone would be in favor. West Virginia, Cincinnati, UCF would be in favor because I think, truthfully, I wonder if the Big 12 gets to a point where they end up somewhat fracturing like the old Big East, where in that situation you had football schools and basketball powers who were private Catholic schools who had differing priorities. They fracture and split up and go their own ways. Because if you add UConn to the Big 12, do you have differing priorities for what Cincinnati, West Virginia, UCF, UConn want compared to what Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Kansas, Baylor, Texas Tech, what they want? And I find that kind of dynamic of the Big 12 really interesting because right now, and somewhat for the foreseeable future, that conference is a conference of convenience, right? Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado needed a home. Cincinnati, West Virginia, UCF needed a home. Iowa State, Kansas, Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, TCU, Baylor, they needed strength in numbers. So none of them are all naturally pulling in the same direction, right? It's about survival. And I think when you start to build your conference around survival rather than flourishing, I think you're setting yourself up a little bit for failure. And so the addition of UConn and why they would be a top dog, it's just essentially like, I think the idea of adding UConn, because maybe that would then also entice Gonzaga to join the conference. And then you hear rumors that if the ACC were to implode because Florida State and Clemson, who just are carrying the banner for that conference right now, are to leave, Louisville and Miami have handshake deals with the Big 12, that if things go south, I don't know why you would want to add UConn right now when there's so much volatility with the ACC schools. Because if you were to put UConn on a list of potential schools to join the conference, would you put them above Clemson, Florida State? No. Virginia Tech? No. Maybe. North Carolina State? No. Duke? No. Miami? No. Georgia Tech? Maybe. So I just, when there's so much volatility, when you have schools suing the ACC to get out of that conference, prioritizing UConn, who obviously and undeniably has been a basketball power, and you can pretend that they bring you the New York market, but the Big 12 doesn't have a conference cable network to earn them money. They don't have a great TV contract to begin with. Then you're going to portion that up again with UConn, who is the top dog in the sport, absolutely, but are they going to stay that power forever? I don't know. I think there's an argument and there's a discussion around whether or not they're a basketball blue blood. I think the question is, yeah, duh. They meet all the qualifications. I don't understand why you would think they wouldn't. But is that worth adding to your conference right now? I don't think the answer to that is yes. And yet the Big 12 was essentially on the verge of doing it if they could get the votes. So sitting here, I'm not 100% sure what the ultimate motivation is. I'm not certain if your ultimate goal is to be a 24-team league with coast-to-coast programs, and you can put college football games from noon Eastern to 1 a.m. Eastern, and basketball games from noon Eastern to 1 a.m. Eastern. I don't think that's the goal, and I don't 100%. I genuinely, I wonder if the idea is, let's just get as many teams as we can, and if we lose some, we're still going to be okay. And if that's the thought process, I don't know how you ever jump up and compete again with the SEC and the Big Ten, because they are not worried about survival. They are not worried about fighting off, this like college realignment nuclear winter. They're worried about domination. And when the gap is already widening and there's already conversation about a power two, then the Big 12 and ACC, then everybody else, instead of trying to get back up to the top of that mountaintop, it feels like the Big 12, I forget the name of the movie, but there's the famous quote where they run into a bear in the middle of the woods, and one character says to the other, why are you taking your shoes off? And he says, I can run faster without my shoes on. And he said, do you think you can outrun that bear? And the other guy says, no, I just have to outrun you. That's what the Big 12 is doing. The Big 12 is saying, I just got to outrun the ACC. And if that's your thought process, I just don't know how you ever think we're going to get back to the top of the college sports mountaintop and be right there alongside the big dogs on the block. So I think that gives you a bit of an insight into how the Big 12 looks at its future. And I don't know that it's overly positive. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Traveling for work, so I'm currently surrounded by hotel bed pillows. Hope you appreciate the effort of getting the program up and on to YouTube and the podcast. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. On YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we are pumping out. And I'll catch you on Sunday for another recap of Week 2 of the college football season. I look forward to chatting with you then here on the Daily Huddle.